tell me about the current state of meditation research? What's going well? What are its problems?
So I think meditation research is a relatively young field, at least in the way that we think about scientific disciplines and how far we've come. So obviously meditation is a practice that's been used for quite some time. But the only kind of proper, if you will, scientific studies, empirical collection of data around meditation only really started in the 1970s. And that was largely focused on transcendental meditation. And that kind of crashed and burned for some fairly complicated reasons that I'm happy to go into if you'd like. So we've only really started the current phase of meditation research, which has largely been focused on mindfulness, as of kind of the late 90s. So if you think about that, we've only really been doing research on meditation in earnest for about 30 years, which is a pretty short period of time when you consider, say, how long we've been studying things like physics or chemistry. So I think that's important to say because it's still a very young field. It's very early days in terms of how we think about these concepts and how we think about how we study it. So as a relatively new field, I think we've done quite a lot in a fairly short period of time, and you'll hear Richie Davidson say this a lot, that the early days of meditation were really focused on really experienced meditators, and I think that was rightfully so. Which is that if you've got people that have been practicing meditation for 30, 40 years, and there's nothing different with their brains, with their behavior, with how they feel, then there's probably no hope for the rest of us, and there's really no point for the rest of us in trying to learn this. And so, that was the kind of first foray, was studying monks and nuns, that had been doing these practices for really long times, and we uncovered some really interesting things. But there's only so much you can say about that. When you study monks and nuns, the challenge is that they're not exactly like everyone else. There's a reason they're monks and nuns, and their lifestyles are a little bit different than, say, yours or mine. So that presents some challenges. But we've gotten better at that. We've gotten better sort of at thinking about who do we compare them to. We've also gotten a lot better sort of at actually doing these studies where, we train people and we follow them over time. But that's a whole other set of challenges because, when we do comparisons to different groups, or when we think about people undergoing training programs, we have to control for things like placebo effects, right? Or we have to control for the fact that time spent learning anything is going to change the way your brain is structured or function or how you feel. So we need control conditions. And so as a field, we've gotten better at that. But the big challenge, I guess, is, well, what's the control condition for learning meditation? What is it we should compare it to? And so while we're getting better at that, I think we still have lots of challenges that we have to unpack as to what should we be comparing mindfulness and meditation to? And so those two areas in particular, I think our neuroscience and our clinical trials, and how we compare these things are getting more sophisticated. But we're still grappling with some really fundamental issues of, when we think about advanced practitioners and their brains and what's going on, how do we know whether the things that are changing in their brains are due to meditation versus other lifestyle factors?
Why don't you tell me about, so transcendental meditation, what is that? And was that a case of trying to kind of go too big, too fast? Like what were the initial hiccups?
The hiccups weren't so much, I don't think, in sort of the speed with which they approached it. I think that the issue was more the opaqueness with which the research was approached, which was to sort of say, that TM is very secretive and quiet about how the practice actually works, right? And so the issues that really, I think, led to the downfall of TM were that effectively when the medical bodies and medical boards came and said, great, it looks like there might be some signal here. We really need to understand how these practices work so that, when we try to explain to medical doctors and other people why they should refer patients to do these things, we can justify it and say, this is actually legitimate and not just, somebody holding magic crystals, right? And the kind of response of the TM community was, yeah, we'll tell you, just sign up for the course and pay us the money. And so obviously the medical community wasn't particularly happy about that, right? And so that kind of like secrecy and opacity, this inability or unwillingness, I guess, to be transparent with what are we actually doing and, how are these methods working and where are they coming from, really just led to this like sharp and immediate crash and burn, where all of a sudden, effectively, people went from being very interested to going, I mean, if you're not going to tell us how this is actually working, then we can't possibly consider mainstreaming this. It can't be part of what we do in the medical community. And that was something that was quite different in terms of the mindfulness like reboot, right? It was very intentionally transparent and very clear from the beginning. And there was a very clear strategy about making sure that scientists, celebrities, big name people were kind of out and talking about what it is, why we're doing it, how it works. And there was a real effort to kind of make it clear. Now, the Buddhist roots were a bit hidden. Those only came out, I would say, within the last 10 years or so, that people kind of came out and acknowledged that mindfulness is a Buddhist practice. That was also quite intentional, though, I think, because there was this perception, particularly in the US, where a lot of the mindfulness work was happening early on, that people just wouldn't respond at all or wouldn't be open to the idea if they knew it was Buddhist. So, I have mixed feelings about that, whether or not sort of that was a good thing or a bad thing. There's a part of me that thinks they should have just disclosed from the beginning that it was Buddhist, but I also recognize that possibly had it been presented that way, particularly in a medical setting, people would have just waved them off.
Right. So in the past, obviously, it's not great to kind of like have no idea what is going on in these practices and not be able to sort of concretely, translate them, see what's going on. And if it's really so beneficial, get other people to do it. But even today, I wonder, because one thing that comes to mind is there still something fundamentally difficult about trying to study meditation, and that you have people's subjective experience and you can never quite know kind of what's going on there, even though you can, and what are the dangers of trying to make it systematized and have a product that you kind of give to everyone and you know how it works. Tell me a bit more about what are the struggles and how to overcome them in studying meditation.
Yeah, look, and this is sort of the main issues that I often talk about in the meditation field. This is the third big one. The first one being the neuroscience, the second one being kind of clinical trials and how we approach them, and the third one really being the definitions, how we talk about the thing we study. And I often talk about this in the context of mindfulness, because that's the main thing that everyone's typically interested in. But it equally applies to other aspects of meditation. We could have the same conversation about jhanas as we could about mindfulness, which is to say, the challenge is that what people think they're doing and what they may actually be doing are not always the same thing. And I guess even more important than that, what people do in different traditions, so you may talk to one type of monk or nun or practitioner, in a secular context, and they say, well, I'm doing the mindfulness practice or the jhana practice or whatever. And then you talk to someone else who's from the same tradition, but in a slightly different version of it, and they might be doing something very different. And then you have the historical component, which is to say that, what mindfulness practice looked like at the time of the Buddha is probably pretty different to what mindfulness practice looks like nowadays. And so this kind of ambiguity about, well, what is it that people are actually doing, and how do we agree to sort of what the practice actually looks like? There is a bit of an assumption that we know what's going on for people internally. And the reality is, obviously, we can't. If you come at this from a philosophical perspective, no one can really understand what it's like to be inside of somebody else's body. So it's a real challenge, I think, for us kind of when we're studying this, because we try to kind of triangulate or agree sort of to the way in which we're going, well, I think the person might be doing this kind of practice, and this is the state they're experiencing, and this is what that might mean. But it's very challenging to kind of ensure that the thing we're studying is the thing that we're interested in. And definitions and terminology are important. When you think about mindfulness, you could be alluding to a practice that the Dalai Lama does, or you could be talking about something that someone does on an app, or you could be talking about, an activity you're doing at your workplace where they're just trying to make you feel less stressed, but they don't actually care about you. So it's this huge challenge of the field, where we're kind of, we're trying to agree upon what the practice is and what people do. But to your point, there's a risk as well, in that as we try to systematize it or standardize it, things get left out. And so the things that get left out, particularly I think when we talk about mindfulness in the Buddhist context, most Buddhists or most people who practice within that tradition would say mindfulness is just one tiny little piece of the practice. Like, you have this whole Noble Eightfold Path, there's 8 elements to it. Mindfulness is just one, right? Like the other things are just as important. And, you're missing the other 7 if you're only talking about mindfulness. So I think it's a really important consideration that, in the effort to systematize these things, we may be leaving out other things that historically were really critical to the practice, right? And that's not something we talk about all that often.
Yeah, interesting. So, like, imagine Buddha's actually living a whole life, and to try and gain wisdom and do certain things, and it's like there's a kind of sometimes a bit of a paradox of if you do meditation, you kind of, it's like maybe you're only going to get benefits unless that is incorporated in a life of you want to make improvements, or and what other things are you doing. Like I certainly feel it with myself in that I want to be more healthy or eat more healthily, but then if you just say, oh well, but I'll leave family relationships and whatever for the time being as well, that they all interfere, right? You can't just have an awful family situation and then think you're going to be able to stay on like a healthy diet. It's it's funny because I think with meditation, I mean, as well, you kind of get to the limits of what science can kind of tackle, because I was, like, for example, talking to Jonathan Davies about placebo in meditation, and like it's like meditation has an impact, but then the science of placebo is really interesting at the moment because we can't ignore it either. There is something fundamental about the practice of medicine, whereby the narrative structure and just everything around the fact that you're being treated and people are trying to help you, and like these placebo meditations, as Jonathan Davies told me, they work amazingly well when they're not, and then the actual meditation where they're not just sitting in a kind of room and being told they're doing mindfulness, like that's better. But it's like there's something about just even the act of, I'm here. I've been told, I always hear that mindfulness is really great for you. And I'm taking some time in my day to actually do something actively for my health. And then that also has an enormous benefit. And
yeah, I think there's two really important points there. One sort of is the broader context and setting in which you do anything, right? Which is to say, sort of, an effort or an endeavor to kind of be healthier. If you only do one thing, so you only exercise more, but you don't also consider your diet, right? That's a problem. Like, so, it may be that you're exercising a lot more, but you're, eating fried chicken at every meal. Like, so, I mean, sure, like physically, like you may be in a bit better shape, but like if all you're eating is fried chicken, that's not going to be the best thing for you. And similarly, like if you don't address sleep, you're not sleeping well. That's probably going to be a problem as well, because you're not necessarily going to be physically healthier. So it's the same thing, I think, in these contexts. And when you're thinking about the way in which you would go about the practice, historically, they would have said, well, what are you doing it for? Is it just so that you have better awareness of your mind, or is it so that you are a better person in the world? And many traditions would have said, well, it's so that you're a better person in the world, right? And if you don't think about how you go about living your life, and you're somebody in the military, for example, who your job is to kill people, and you're using mindfulness to make you more efficient at that, well, maybe you're more efficient at doing that, but arguably that's a pretty different endpoint or goal than someone who's using the practice towards being more altruistic and being kinder and nicer and making the world safer and less violent. So I think that's really important to think about and consider. And then I think your other point, around, I guess this idea of, can we actually measure the experiences that people have, right? And I think placebo is a really great example, because fundamentally there's something about the placebo effect whereby it essentially, it means it's working for you, like you're seeing actual benefits, and you as the individual, I mean, it's real to you, right? Like you're feeling better, you're feeling less pain. So, I mean, as someone on the outside, like I can't say you're not getting benefit from it. Like you are getting benefit from it. But what I can say is you're not getting benefit from it for the reasons that I think you are. And so this is the challenge, right? With meditation as well, like just because we can't identify something in the brain as changing, or just because we can't see something on an external measure, doesn't mean that you're not experiencing something really meaningful. And that's often where we encounter challenges, which is that, there's limits to what we can measure. We've seen this in some studies we've done on looking at dose response, right? Which is this idea of how much do you have to practice, and relative to that practice, where do you get benefits? And so what we've seen in some of our studies is that some of the biggest benefits are earlier on in the practice, right? And so the slope, the steepest increase or the steepest changes in mental health and well-being are fairly early in people's practices. And when we think about why that might be, we could say, well, it's just early practice, and that practicing for too long, you don't get any more benefits. But another possible interpretation is that it's a limitation of the way that we measure progress or outcomes, which is to say that, early on, we may see a lot of changes in mental health measures, but that the thing that's changing later on in practice has nothing to do with mental health, right? Like, in other words, there's only so far you can go in terms of not being depressed. Once you're not depressed, you can't get less not depressed. And so when we start to think about well-being, it gets more complicated the more well-being you develop. And if we start to talk about bigger concepts, spiritual growth, or feeling like you're connected to things outside of yourself, or a bigger part of humanity, or you have a greater sense of purpose, we start to get into ideas or constructs that are harder to measure. It's harder for us to pin these things down. And as a result, you might go, well, I'm experiencing incredible benefits in my life. I feel greater love, I feel greater connection. But as scientists, we go, cool, well, where do I find that in the brain, or how do I measure that? And so it's a real challenge. And the fact that we can't observe it doesn't make it any less real to the individual. Like for them, it's totally real, just like the placebo effect. Like they feel less pain. That's great. But much like the placebo effect, like it's very hard for us to go, but we don't really know why.
Yeah, I would also think that, yeah, you say once you get, say, through a hump of depression, and sort of, you might think of maybe these things as an acute scenario in one's life. I mean, but then if you develop a meditation practice, I mean, you could also argue maybe that might help you tackle more problems in your life, or like help you start reorganizing your life and say, okay, actually, like I am now a more competent, capable person, right? But then that could, in theory, like lower short-term or increase short-term anxiety or issues, but like there is some kind of human personal progression, and again, that's kind of a limit of what variables can you measure, and difficulties of I assume, and I wonder what your opinion is of like medicine in general, and how one can like track people kind of throughout their lives beyond just does the medical profession just kind of you come in for a problem and they try and find a solution sort of in the short term, but then afterwards it's sort of like how what are you doing to stop them from coming back again?
Yeah,
sort of afterwards.
I mean, that's a big issue, right? And I mean, in terms of what the predominant focus in Western medicine is sort of managing acute illness, disease. But basically, we're focused on people coming in crisis with something really broken or wrong, and medicine and the the psychological or the medical approach sort of really is often to kind of say, well, someone's coming to me with incredible distress, or so with some illness that I need to help them manage or get rid of effectively. And once they get rid of that, I've done my job. And so it doesn't really consider the other dimension of that, or the other side of that, which is, well, what happens when they've reached that kind of that baseline of, okay, the illness is no longer there, but how do I help them maybe to go further beyond that? So this, in other words, like, the other side of illness, this idea of wellness or well-being, how do we promote that? But then I think further to your point, there's also the idea sort of preventing people from getting ill again, from recurrence of illness. And so I think this is really challenging, because medicine traditionally kind of struggles with the idea of well-being. But also I think what a lot of people struggle with, and what my strong position is that, illness and wellness are not opposite sides of a continuum, right? So not being depressed doesn't mean you're happy. And, and being happy doesn't necessarily mean, although it's probably unlikely, but it doesn't necessarily mean you're not a little bit depressed, right? So there's an element to which well-being and illness, or mental health and mental illness, are actually related to each other, but they're not on the same continuum. And we have to work at promoting both. We have to work at sort of promoting wellness or well-being as well as sort of managing illness. And I think if we can shift our mindset into that direction, then we're not just thinking about how to manage acute illness, and we're not just thinking about how to prevent illness, which we do way too little of, but we're also thinking about how to help people flourish. And it's that really, fundamental shift in our orientation that I guess first away from just we manage illness when it's the worst to maybe now we can do something upstream and prevent it, to going even further and saying it's not even just about preventing illness, it's actually about helping people flourish and live happy, meaningful lives. And that's a really big shift. I think that's sort of not something that medicine is really designed to do. Medicine is designed to be you turn up when you have a problem, right? Like, I don't know, kind of like the barbershop model. You turn up when you need a haircut, right? You don't necessarily go in preventatively thinking, I want my hair to look better in the future.
Yeah, it's something I think about in a lot of Western culture of can we, split things up so you go, you go to the hairdressers for this thing and the doctors for this thing, and like for some things for hairdressers that kind of makes perfect sense, but yeah, for like, can one actually live a healthy life by sort of commoditizing things? And to bring meditation back into here, how can that help things like anxiety and depression? How should we think about anxiety and depression? And then maybe, and we'll try and get also down the road of as well how and why is meditation working to sort of improve people's lives even beyond those kind of initial stages of getting people out of these sort of acute issues.
Yeah, there the evidence isn't definitive by any means. We've only been doing trials, particularly trials comparing to active controls, on a regular basis, sort of probably since the 2000s, I think. There are some earlier trials, but most of them were pretty small. But the evidence, and particularly the most recent evidence, sort of is pretty good. Particularly when you talk about mindfulness-based stress reduction, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. So these standard structured kind of 8 to 12 week programs that teach people how to meditate. I often say that, and I emphasize that because we go back to that definitional issue, and many organizations that are advocating or promoting mindfulness, they bank on the evidence of these programs, and what they sell you looks nothing like that. So a lot of the app companies, when they tell you mindfulness is really helpful for you, what they're giving you looks nothing like MBSR and MBCT, but they love to talk about how well MBSR and MBCT works, right? Because it's kind of this bait and switch. We're talking about mindfulness. Mindfulness really works. We'll give you some mindfulness, but in the process of talking about the evidence and what the product that they're giving you is, they've somehow changed the definition of mindfulness. So I think that's an important thing to note. But look, the reality sort of is it works pretty well. It doesn't necessarily work better than other gold standard treatments. So if you have anxiety, depression, it may be that cognitive behavioral therapy or antidepressants is better for you. And I think that's something that's also important for people to know, that you shouldn't give up on kind of traditional medical approaches, and you shouldn't just go, well, I've got anxiety, depression, I should take up mindfulness meditation. For some people, it's just not a good fit. But for others, it really is, right? And there's increasingly promising studies that would seem to suggest that some of these approaches for some people may be as good as antidepressants, may be as good as our gold standard treatments. I think we're getting more and more evidence to suggest that's true. And I think the key thing we're starting to talk about increasingly in the field is we need to know more about which people will respond differently. And I think I hinted at that earlier on, that sort of, there's a huge element of kind of trial and error in mental health, where, we spend a lot of time kind of guessing as to what we think will work for people. And it's really unproductive in a lot of ways. And, people spend time trying things that don't work for them. And, a lot more time and energy could be invested in trying to figure out how do we get people the things that work faster and work for them. How do we get people to the things that will work for them faster? And that's a really big question in the field. And I think it's increasingly sort of a question that many people that are studying meditation also want to know. How do we know, or how can we learn or predict whether meditation or mindfulness meditation in particular could work for you?
I wonder how MRI and kind of actually studying the brain fits in with meditation, because we talked off the air a bit about you get in like modern decades, you get some cool new tools like MRI and things to study, neuroscience, actually becomes a field in the 90s. But there's a kind of a broader issue of, because as you say there, I mean, meditation could be really good, but it kind of depends. And there's a trial and error component of whether one should try it and if that's going to be something valuable to fit into someone's life. And I wonder what you think about ways people can try and systematically try and understand how meditation works, whether it will work with some people, and whether ultimately it's possible, whether through better understanding the brain and the mechanisms of meditation, or maybe are there personality factors that one can study. I'm wondering, I guess I'm bringing a broader issue of studying things in neuroscience and cognition, but then also practically, how does that translate into trying to understand individual differences and sort of the actual mechanisms for how things are working here?
I think my kind of take on what we know about the brain and what it can tell us sort of is probably pretty heavily informed by Tom Insel, the former director of the National Institute of Mental Health. And one of the things that Tom Insel said shortly after he left the National Institute of Mental Health was that we spent a lot of money and a lot of time studying the brain, and we learned a lot of really cool things about the brain and very little, if anything at all, about mental health. Which is not to say that understanding more about the brain may not eventually prove really helpful for understanding mental health, right? Ultimately, I think understanding the brain and how the brain contributes to or underpins behavior, in the long run, I think it will be really useful, because arguably, what's going on in the brain is really important to how people behave and what they do in the world. The problem, though, is that our tools are probably not fine-grained enough to really give us a whole lot of information at the level of the individual. Brain scans are expensive. There's a lot of error in the signals. Statistics that we use in clinical trials, let alone in neuroimaging, are averages. And so when you have smallish samples, you increase the margin of error. And you're less likely to be talking about relevance for individual people. And so I think what we've observed in a lot of neuroimaging studies is kind of average or core mechanisms that might be at play in terms of what's going on with people. And I think that that's very hard or challenging to translate then to an individual. So we may learn on average that the default mode plays an important role in kind of mind wandering or people's self-perception or experiences. But what the default mode network looks like for a given individual is probably pretty variable. And so I think we're pretty far away from the point of being able to say we could fingerprint someone in terms of, have a model of what their default mode network looks like, and being able to say anything meaningful in relationship to their propensity towards illness or wellness or depression, or how meditation might help them from that. I think we're getting better at thinking about that and talking about that. And I think there are ways that we can think about how do we get to that point, though, of kind of knowing more about people and how they might benefit by knowing things like their personality, or their maybe attentional biases, or certain proclivities that they have to react in particular ways to threatening stimuli or things like that. The challenge from my perspective is that in a lot of the biomedical disciplines, particularly the ones that are sort of related to mental health, like neuroimaging, we spend a lot of time calibrating the equipment that we use to look at the brain, right? We don't often in those same experiments use or dedicate anywhere near as much time calibrating or thinking about the experience that we're measuring while the people are in that machine. And so we use these instruments to measure, say, anxiety or mindfulness, or we tell people to do some kind of meditation when they're in the scanner. But we're not as careful about saying, do we know that those people are doing a similar thing? Or do we know that when they say they're anxious, we're capturing the same variety or version of anxiety? And so the problem then becomes, even if the same brain activity is active, or the same brain region is active, what if they're doing different things? Or what if they're doing the same thing, but we see different patterns of brain activity? And what do we do with that? And so I think that's the situation we're in with the neuroscience, is that, we're really struggling to grapple with that challenge of, we may see the brain activity in a particular region and people are having totally different experiences, or we may know they're having the same experience, but we see totally different brain regions being active.
Right.
And so I think that's been part of the shift towards networks, and focus on networks in the brain, which is kind of getting away from this idea of let's focus on one brain area. I mean, more generally, though, I think we are starting to do some really good research around personality features or tendencies towards anxiety, or even just kind of basic things around going, for whom might meditation be contraindicated, right? And we know things like, well, if you have a trauma history, it's probably not a great idea for you to jump into meditation, particularly if there's a body scan. That's just something we go, it's probably not a good idea. We know, for example, as well, if you've got a history, family history, or huge risk factors for psychosis, meditation's probably not a great practice for you, at least not the kind of focus on your head and contemplate whether yourself is an enduring thing. It's probably not a great thing for you to do if you're, at risk for psychosis. So we're getting better at those kinds of things, but we're still a long way off, I think, from individual level recommendations.
Yeah, like I like you talking about personality factors, or just translating someone's like position, life, mental states. Like I sometimes think we need a better language of like almost the phenomenology of experience, and having psychological constructs that actually maybe don't not necessarily rely on the brain. Like maybe eventually that could come in later, where we see networks, we can better understand what like computational capacities of the brain. But like that's actually something I sometimes like about field that I'm in, economics, that actually there is neuroeconomics, but sometimes they kind of just go like, we don't care about trying to see what's going on in the brain or something, because like can we get like a shared language beyond that. Like it's interesting. I was reading the neuroscientist Eric Hole talking about like just kind of, unfortunately, with statistical size of like neuroscience studies, you probably just need it in at least the thousands, and so it's sort of like, just do it again. Like we can't trust this, and so maybe it would be helpful, but that in the thousands, it costs so much money, and so
although look, advances in some of our models and approaches are helpful in the sense of like there's been a bit of a shift towards using Bayesian statistics, and things like that actually are the kinds of they give us a tool that might actually better allow for us to understand things both at the group level and at the individual level. And you mentioned the example of neuroeconomics, and it's an interesting example of where we're wedding together different disciplines, right? We're taking knowledge from economics, we're taking knowledge from neuroscience, we're taking knowledge from psychology, and we're finding ways for the knowledge from these different disciplines to talk to each other. And I think that's also increasingly true, at least among a number of my colleagues in meditation and meditation research, that we're taking more seriously the humanities and how the humanities understand experience, and how do we work with colleagues in the humanities to really think about how do we characterize phenomenology, the felt experience of something, and then once we know that, how do we actually translate that into terminology that might make sense to psychiatrists or neuroscientists, psychologists, so that we might even know what we're looking for. And so there are ways in which you can think about getting these different languages, the language of experience and the language of observing behavior and the language of observing the brain, to start to talk to each other. One of the mechanisms or one of the models that's been promoted for quite some time, but there's not been a whole lot of work in it, is called neurophenomenology. So Francisco Varela was this huge advocate for this approach, and Antoine Lutz has done a decent amount of work in the area. And the idea of neurophenomenology is that you really strive to integrate first, second, and third person perspectives. And you each of them has equal bearing and respect in terms of being a valid piece of information. So you take the person's firsthand report of what they're experiencing at face value, and then you have a secondhand person who knows a lot about what it's like to meditate, but also knows a decent amount about, let's say, brain imaging, right? And they help to kind of see if they can translate the experience of meditation into psychological or neuroscientific terms. And then you've also got the person who's got the expertise in neuroimaging, and they're all in the room together and they're talking. And then you take it even further and you go, okay, cool, let's get a Buddhist studies scholar in this conversation as well. And let's clarify terminology here. And let's bring in discussion of what are the assumptions of particular approaches of meditation. And then you bring a sociologist in and you go, okay, let's understand, or an anthropologist, let's understand the culture of academic research. And let's be careful that we're not presuming that someone from a very Western tradition is going to look the same as someone from a very Eastern tradition, or someone who's coming from an indigenous culture. What they're doing and how they understand the world may look very different. So their practice may look very different. And how do we account for those different things? And so I think that's one thing we're getting better at, the biggest challenge of true interdisciplinary work is that it's really slow. And it's slow because you genuinely have to take the time to understand the other person and the other discipline. And you have to try to understand it from the inside out, right? It can't just be, I respect that you have an opinion and I'm okay with that. It has to be, let me try to actually understand you on your terms, not necessarily on mine.
Awesome. What is the future for you and your work? How are you thinking about things?
So, I mean, look, two really big projects we're focusing on. And I think these are some of, I think, what I see as some of the most important areas that we need to address in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. One is this question of how do people practice and how much do they practice to get benefit? So this question of, should I be practicing 10 minutes a day, 15 minutes a day? Do I have to do it every day? Is it better if I do it, on my own at home? Should I be going to retreats? Should I be doing it twice a day? So what's the form in which people best learn these things? And my suspicion is actually that it's a bit of a combination, right? There sort of is formal practice on your own at home, but I think a different type of learning might take place when you go on a retreat, when you really do intensive practice. I think that it's very likely that some types of learnings and experiences can potentially only happen in those really intensive settings. But also really intensive settings for some people are really counterproductive, right? So I think we really need to understand more about the different, what I'd call dose response problems. And, it's not just dose, because it's not just amount, it's also frequency and setting. So that's one thing I think we really need to know more about. The other thing I think we need to know more about, and another thing that we're really focusing on at the center that I direct, is indicators or markers of progress. So, how do we kind of map the space that people might move through as they progress in a meditative or contemplative practice? And the reason that that's important is we need to know what to tell people ahead of time. We need to be able to kind of warn people that certain experiences might occur. And we need to give them the opportunity to have informed consent and agree, okay, you may have some really scary experiences. Knowing that, you still want to go ahead. But also, as we're working with people in these practices, we then have some way of saying to them, okay, it sounds like you may be stuck in this particular stage, or you may be at this point. Here are some things that might work for you to kind of get out of that point or move on to the next point. And there are actually traditional models, within traditional contexts of practice. There are models that sort of exist that say, well, these are the kinds of stages maybe you go through. And so we're doing some work to see, are those models valid? Are they useful in terms of actually guiding or coaching people through something like a mindfulness meditation practice? And I think we need longitudinal studies, and we need more developed models for what that space looks like, so that we can actually better guide people through these experiences that come up when they're practicing. So I think those two things to me are just really critical in terms of what has to happen in the next 10, 15, 20 years.
Yeah. And is there any way you want to point people for to go see your work? Or
yeah, so I mean, essentially all of the work that's happening at the Contemplative Studies Centre is on our website. So if you just Google Contemplative Studies Centre, University of Melbourne, you can pretty easily find it. So there's information about the center that I direct, my wonderful and amazing colleagues, many, if not all, of our research projects that we're currently doing, publications from past studies. We put on opportunities for people to try out all kinds of different contemplative practices from lots of different traditions. We host talks so people can hear from representatives of different traditions. So all of that can be found on our website, and you can also sign up for our newsletter, join our social media accounts, etc. So yeah, Contemplative Studies Centre at the University of Melbourne.
Awesome. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Appreciate it.